And everything before Ramadan. Yes. It's like we're starting the countdown of trying to squeeze everything that is possible in the next few days. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be able to introduce this talk this afternoon, or let me put it this way, conversation with Jason. Jason, for me, is not simply economic. He's like a backbone of how we want to think about the relationship between the social sciences, or us in general, and the Gap Group. And I think he sits in there at the cusp of both bringing both of us together. Jason, an associate professor of law, but at the same time, for me, as Hanan, an anthropologist, and as us, he has been a key figure in our trying to think through how to live a genocide, a very important figure in all the attempts on campus to get us to take a moment of rethinking and revisiting our paradigms with regard to law, Palestine, settler colonialism, violence. And I think today's talk, and all of you are familiar with Jason in terms of his critiques of international law and international humanitarian law in specific. We've heard him take us through very interesting conversations and revisiting of those. This afternoon, I think we're continuing in that direction with editorial. International law is still a very important part of the story. Violence is still a very important part, but the detour that we're taking is through a feminist perspective. So it's a critique of law from third world perspective, or global south, whatever you want to call it, but really trying to think through how notions about violence and reason somehow are part of revisiting what and how we understand law, and where would a feminist perspective re-interrogating the very category of law and reason through that bring us to really reimagine our worlds in a different way, if possible. That's one of the hardest things at these moments, but I think reimagining and trying to always believe that other things are possible except what has been given to us as common sense is the way to go in these very troubling times, and troubling is such an understatement to actually speak about what we're going through. So without me taking any time of Jason's time, and time is a very important thing. Jason, we are all eager and excited for you to take us through law, care, and violence towards a Schmittian feminism. Thank you very much for being with us in class. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I am going to start with an apology. This talk is not as well organized as I would like it to be. Due to family circumstances, I was unable to research in January when I tried to write this talk, so what you have instead is my notes from December. I apologize in advance for that. I also apologize for not speaking about Gaza. It feels almost obscene to talk about abstract issues of reason when we're in the last 6 days of a cause of a genocide that will usually be live streamed. But in terms of the way that I'm thinking today, I want to point out that Gaza is not just a catastrophic failure of the framework of justice, it's also a sociopathic absence of the framework of care. Right, with those out of the way, I will move not to my talk, but to 3 preliminary observations. Observation 1. Law and justice have not always been understood as we understand them now. Justitia has not always been blind. And Justitia is an old goddess, descended obviously from ancient Egypt, often armed and often carrying scales. The first records of her existence as Ma'at date from around 2800 BC in Egypt. In Greece, she became famous in the 8th century, and her daughter Nike joined her in the 7th century BC. Justitia came to Rome around 20 BC. Justitia was first blindfolded in 1543 AD, and even that was intended as a satire. So the goddess had 4,500 years of vision, of context, of prudence, of outcome orientation before she was satirically blinded by European men. We also know that there have throughout history been other forms of law: trial by oath, trial by combat, private war, perhaps most aptly Sharia law. Sharia law, properly understood, is not the blind application of a set of rules, but the wise choice from between 4 interpretations of any given rule. Yet the blindness of Justitia became normalized and indeed celebrated by the end of the 16th century. Justice was reduced to the blind and mechanical application of rules. It need not have been that way, and it need not stay that way. Second observation, as Hanan pointed out, I'm an international lawyer. And one of the key units in international law is the state. And the state is a combination of territory, population, and government. Having secured its territory, the government or the state pays soldiers and police to protect the population. They pay engineers and builders to provide shelter and transport for the population. They pay farmers and merchants to feed and clothe the population. They pay teachers and professors to guide and educate the population. They pay lawyers and judges to regulate the population. They pay doctors and nurses to keep the population healthy. But they do not pay women for producing the population. In fact, they economically punish women for producing the population. And that is really tremendously odd. If the population is core to the existence of the state, then the reproduction of the population should be the most centrally important job in the state, and yet it is removed entirely from the paid economy. It wasn't always that way, it need not be that way, and it need not stay that way. Final, slightly more trivial observation. Here at ABC, for our undergrads, we have compulsory courses in philosophical thinking and scientific thinking. To the best of my knowledge, there are 0 female thinkers on either curricula. We have no classes, compulsory or optional, in empathetic reasoning, in emotional intelligence, in feminist epistemology, or in feminist theory of science. We are taught and we teach our students to think like men. Okay, sorry, finally, the talk. Law and science, the rationalities of capitalism. I'm going to cover, roughly speaking, reason's rise to hegemony, its contingency, and the failings that its critique has brought out, how these came from and were brought back to law. I'll also talk a little bit about persecution, misogyny, exclusion, and exploitation. I could talk about classism, racism, imperialism, and genocide too, but I'll skip those for a change. So, the development of modern law and objective reason is a historical process. And it is a historical process that is part of the long gestation of capitalism. I could start the story in 15th century Portugal with the first African colonies, the first black slaves, the first papal bull authorizing colonialism, or the creation of proto-capitalism in the destruction of Madeira. I'll start slightly earlier, in the 12th century in England and gradually across Western Europe. The 12th century saw the beginning of a process called enclosure. And to understand enclosure, it's important to understand that until recently, land wasn't considered private property. No one could own land. Instead, land was a bundle of rights distributed amongst different groups. Rights to forage, rights to hunt, rights to fish, rights to garner crops. And these rights were shared, and they provided the conditions under which communities could feed and clothe themselves. They provided the basic necessities of life. So the purpose of enclosure was twofold. One, to concentrate land in the hands of the already wealthy, and that was justified under a doctrine of improving the land. But the second and far more important reason was to separate the working class from the means of subsistence, to make the working class relying on money, wage labor, and selling their time, because the state had taken away their rights to access food and shelter. The process of enclosure accelerated rapidly over the 15th and 16th centuries. In 1494, the English government passed the Vagabond and Beggars Act, which literally made it illegal for someone not to have a job. Anyone caught without an independent income and without a job could be kidnapped and either enslaved in the Navy or sold into private slavery. Silvia Federici adds to Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation, pointing out that as the peasantry were deprived of the rights of subsistence, so women were removed entirely from the productive economy. The new wage labor economy was to be an economy exploiting men, while relying on those men to support the women who would produce the next generation of population to be exploited. So women were in effect doubly dispossessed. Women, we could say, were triply dispossessed, because also in the 15th century, the process of the witch hunt began. and this was a systematic extermination of women across Western Europe, the United Kingdom, and the then forming United States of America. The witch hunts were a process of misogynistic genocide, of primitive accumulation, of social exclusion, but also of the destruction of knowledge. The witch hunts intensified from 1560 to 1630. Women were systematically excluded from power, society knowledge, their reproductive labour is expropriated, as with their land and access to means of subsistence, they are left the third-class citizens of a growing capitalist economy. The targets, of course, were not random. They were leaders, they were thinkers, they were healers, and of course, and most especially, they were those with reproductive knowledge. Plus assorted other outspoken or otherwise evil women. In 1561, the University of Cambridge was granted a royal charter to imprison any woman suspected of evil. It was allowed to run its own private police force and its own private jail, in which it incarcerated over 200 years over 6,000 evil women. The witch hunts finally end around 1750. Estimates vary, but at least 50,000 women were killed. Healers, midwives, leaders, thinkers. In other words, feminine knowledge and feminine ways of knowing were systematically destroyed. And that leads us to the questions of reason and truth. The question of how we know what we know. So as feminine wisdom, as feminine reason was being violently eradicated, male rationality was being constructed. And in particular, scientific rationality was being constructed. As Lawrence Lawton writes, at its best, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, is philosophy of science. One can go further and suggest that to the extent that the history of epistemology is not the history of the philosophy of science, it has no business being called epistemology at all. In other words, we in modernity can only know things through science. The philosophy of science was roughly born in 1620. And it was born as part of a political struggle. And that political struggle was fought by what would become liberalism in two separate fronts. One was to get theology out of politics, and the other was to get theology out of knowledge. Between them, these traditions created the rational man who would refuse, in the application of universal rules, to devolve certain powers and thus retain rights against the state. These natural rights would be discovered using the scientific method and its offspring reason. Not coincidentally, they protected the wealthy against the dangers of democracy. So the 15th century was very different to our present world. Knowledge and perception were very different. It was an organic, holistic, geocentric, and theological world, ruled by divine right, with truth derived from scripture and syllogism. For the 16th and the 17th centuries, see the beginnings of the birth of capitalism and the secularization of politics and knowledge. It starts in 1543 when Nicola Copernicus writes his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres and theorizes a heliocentric universe where the Earth is no longer at the center and man, by implication, is no longer especially loved by God. Copernicus, of course, faced infamy and persecution before eventually being vindicated and finding fame. The most important thing, though, is that he shook the theological universe. He shook the basic grounds for knowing what we know. Incidentally, that was the same year that Justinian was blindfolded. In 1580, an Englishman called Richard Hooker wrote a book called Of the Laws Ecclesiastical Polity. And it was the first book that I know of to argue that political and legal authority belong, in his words, in reason rather than Rome. So there was a separation in Hooker's work between reason and theology, but it wasn't a full separation because he also noted that reason came from God. And that's an idea, incidentally, that will survive until at least Kant and probably Habermas. In 1610, Galileo wrote Starry Messenger, where he provided observational evidence for Copernicus' theory of heliocentricity, and the Earth was finally decentered, God shaken further, but not yet dethroned. Then along came a chap called Francis Bacon. And Bacon was an English lawyer. A lawyer and a judge and a Privy Council advisor to the king. Bacon wrote a series of books. In my opinion, the most important is Novum Organum, the New Organon. And this book could be seen in its time as a borderline heresy, as it tries entirely to exclude theology from the questions of science and knowledge. But it does so while retaining or consistently reaffirming a belief in the validity of theological knowledge in other spheres. Now, what I believe Francis Bacon did is he took a mythology from the English common law and he transposed it into what we now call natural science. English common law, as you may know, is an unwritten system of law. And it works the wrong way round from a civil perspective. English common law starts with the particulars of the case and works its way to the general rule and then back down to the particulars of the case. And it's an iterative process. Cases build on one another. And the theory is that over time, the judges, using this iterative method, particular rule, will discover the true and timeless rules of the common law. And so Bacon took the system based on the move up and down, based on the observation of the particular, based on the interrogation of witnesses and objects, and he turned it into the interrogation of nature. All true and fruitful natural philosophy at the double scale or ladder, ascendant and descendant, ascending from experiments to the invention of causes, and descending from the causes to the invention of new experiments. This dialectical process organizes experience into the discovery of rules, axioms, and predictive hypotheses, like the gradual discovery of the common law through judicial precedent, it unveils the laws of nature, the laws that nature must obey. Now, it's important that Bacon never wanted to take on nature in nature's own terms. Experiments sought to drive nature out of its existence and against its will. Bacon and others reduced nature to a female to be exploited. Bacon indeed frequently referred to nature as, and I quote, a common harlot who must be penetrated and tortured into revealing her secrets. I am laying down in the human intellect the foundations for a true model of the world. This can't be done unless the world is subject to a very diligent dissection and anatomical study. Nature's secrets come to light better when she is artificially shaken up than when she goes about on her own way. Neither ought a man to make scruple of entering and penetrating into those holes and corners where the inquisition of truth is his whole object. Mean and sordid events sometimes give off excellent and informative light. That is enough about this, more than enough, because this sort of squeamishness is downright childish and effeminate. What we're looking at here, again, is a process of abstraction. It's a process of taking the particular out of its context, out of its relations, into the abstract towards the universal, the axioms, the general rules, the truths. The whole affair is a matter of getting from the complicated to the simple, from the incommensurable to the commensurable, from the random to the calculable, from the infinite and vague to the finite and certain. For those of you who have the good fortune not to go to law school, that is an almost perfect description of how law school teaches the function of law. Carolyn Merchant, in her book The Death of Nature, sums Bacon up rather nicely. The interrogation of witches is the symbol for the interrogation of nature. The courtroom, the model for its inquisition, and torture through mechanical devices, the tool for the subjugation of disorder. These were fundamental to the scientific method. For Timothy Rice, just as Descartes will, Bacon implies that method, once discovered, will allow the same access to a common and identical store of good sense. Access, that is, to objective knowledge. I'm going to skip Descartes, I don't like him as a writer, but Suzanne Bardot wrote a wonderful text called The Cartesian Masculinization of Thought. And in it she wrote, the model of knowledge that Descartes bequeathed to modern science, and of which he's often explicitly described as the father, is based on clarity, dispassion, and detachment. What we encounter in Cartesian rationalism is the pure masculinization of thought. The scientific model of knowing, says Sandra Harding, represents a super-masculinization of rational knowledge. The specific consciousness we call scientific, Western, and modern is the long, sharpened tool of the masculine mind that has discarded parts of its own substance, calling them Eve, female, and inferior. Right, 1651, Hobbes writes a book, 1687, Newton writes a book, 1687, John Locke writes a book. That's an interesting book on the two treatises on government. And it's interesting because you see these two battles for the freeing of knowledge and the freeing of politics come perfectly together for the first time in the two treatises. By the end of the 17th century, 40% of the English population had been reduced to wage labour. 1714, Leibniz wrote a book called Monadology, in which he postulated the principle of sufficient reason as, in effect, a proof of the existence of God and the rationality of the universe. The process, I would say, closes with Kant and the critique of pure reason, where he praises Francis Bacon as the greatest physicist of all times and gives the final statement of abstract deontological knowledge as human knowledge. Kant, again, was very much thinking about men and not women. In fact, we know that a woman who has her head full of logic or conducts disputations about philosophy might as well also wear a beard. So what I want to emphasize is that the process of de-theologization of knowledge was also a process of defeminization of knowledge. The exclusion of the religious and the feminine, the turn to objectivity and the search for hidden laws and universality. These would include the creation of the proletariat through enclosure and the exclusion of women's reproductive labour from the paid economy. Fortunately, reason's ascent to hegemony did not come without challenges, and a movement that we could loosely call the existentialists offered the key critiques. But the existentialist movement stretches across the 19th and 20th centuries, and I haven't picked any particularly representative thinkers yet. There's David Hume, obviously, and I'll return briefly to legal realism and German legal realism. There's Karl Popper and Paul Feyerabend, who argued for epistemic anarchy in the social sciences. But primarily, it is a critique of the limits of cause and effect. It's the question of ultimate power or truth, the question of causation and beginnings. So Leibniz argues that the reasons for the world lie hidden in something extra-mundane, different from the chain of states or from the series of things, the collection of which constitutes the world. And so we must pass from the physical or hypothetical necessity which determines the later things in the world from the earlier to something of absolute or metaphysical necessity, something for which your reason cannot be given. According to Bill Rash, Leibniz, of course, calls this something for which your reason cannot be given God. Thereby, he thought establishing his necessity and thus his existence. As the 18th century critics of reason soon pointed out, what Leibniz had in fact established was not the rationality of the world created by a God who serves as its sufficient reason, but rather the irrationality of reason itself, which, like all other systems of belief that seek foundations in origin, requires a leap of faith. Immanuel Kant himself said, "I can give you a rational reason for everything except accepting rational reasons. There can be no rational reason to be rational. It's an irrational choice. It's a belief. Reality is a contingent belief structure, and reason, especially with a capital R, is a very poor surrogate for God." This has been pointed out obviously by Max Weber and Carl Schmitt, who wish to get rid of reason and liberal order as such and reduce them to the war of the clashing gods, where the divine throne stays empty and we accept that there is no universal position, no objectivity, no rational truth. Really long time on this, no, sorry. Right, in the early 20th century, this existentialist critique was brought back into law as a critique of legal reasoning and legal functioning. particularly by Carl Schmitt. Schmitt rehearses a long-standing critique of Western rationalism that he uses to undermine the self-understanding of the liberal rule of law. Central to this critique is the recognition of the paradoxical limits of the laws of causality. So reason obviously is based on cause and effect. But as we all know, the problem with cause and effect is it leads to an infinite regress. What was the effect of that? But what was the cause of that? 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 Which ultimately leads us to the irrationalist question, why do things exist? So one reason, or one way to close that infinite regress is to posit a God who was himself uncaused and the sufficient cause of everything that came after. Once you reject, or if you bracket, that religious solution, then you see that reason is entirely unfounded. And what Schmitt and the American legal realists showed through detailed analysis is that in practice, law is not the application of rules. Law is judges making political decisions and then reverse engineering a discourse of rules to justify or appear to compel those decisions. So reason is a contingent construct, blah, 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 right. Now I'm going to take a huge jump and talk a little bit about psychology of moral development. And I wanted to tell you about the work of a man called Lawrence Kohlberg, who wrote the theory of moral development, which is still the standard mapping of moral development in psychology. Two things are interesting about Kohlberg's work. One is its longitudinal. It's a 20-year study returning to the same subjects to gauge change over time. The other is that he only studied men and boys. And in fact, Kohlberg picks up his work from a chap called Jean Piaget. And Piaget studied the way kids played games. And he studied the way boys played games, and he wrote a theory of moral reasoning for games. Then he introduced girls into his analysis, and he found, and I quote his words, that girls disturbed the evidence. So he excluded them. He just stopped studying them anymore. He went back to studying men. Kohlberg does the same. Erickson does the same. Then this young woman called Carol Gilligan comes along. She initially works with Kohlberg. She does her PhD with him. She's a research assistant with him. And she says, why can't we have women in this data? So Kohlberg introduced these women into the data, or into the analysis, and what he shows, essentially, is that women are morally retarded. Sorry, but the purpose of morality for Kohlberg is a move from the relational to the abstract. A move from what he calls naive instrumental hedonism to conventional rule conformity and self-accepting moral principles. And in particular, he has 6 stages of moral development. And it's the move between stage 3 and 4 that separates the emotional and the irrational from the rational. And it is true that when you carry out Kohlberg's experiments, women very rarely move from stage 3 to stage 4. Most men reach stage 4 by their early teens, and men may or may not reach stage 5 in their 20s or 30s. Stage 6, despite being an empirical observation, Kohlberg later admitted was a fantasy and had never actually been observed. But the important thing is women don't make it from stage 3 to stage 4. They don't get from the good girl morality of maintaining good relations and approval from others to an authority maintaining morality. They can never abstract themselves from context and relation. And what Gilligan says is, well, maybe that's right. Maybe women can't do that. But that might not be because they're morally deficient. It might be because Kohlberg is measuring rationality wrongly. So we've done studies exclusively on men. Let's now do some studies exclusively on women, and then mixed studies. And what Gilligan claims to find is that men and women reason differently. That men tend towards the abstract, the rule-oriented, and the entitlement-oriented. Women prefer context, the maintenance of relationships, and equitable outcomes. Now, Gilligan casts these, I think, in biologically essentialist terms, but I don't think it's important whether they're biologically essentialist or not. What Gilligan says is this: when I hear my work being cast in terms of whether women and men are really essentially different or who is better than whom, I know that I've lost my voice, because these are not my questions. My questions are about our perceptions of reality and truth, how we know, how we hear, how we see, and how we speak. My questions are about voice and relationship. In other words, speaking for myself, I don't want to tell a gender story. I want to tell the story of a repressed and subjugated reason, a reason that I believe we would do well to liberate and cherish, but a reason that has historically, empirically, and perhaps even scientifically been associated with women. Right, Gilligan develops an ethics of care, a different form of moral thinking. You see two modes of thinking that are not just different, are not just alternative, but are in fundamental tension. What is valued by one, detachment, impartiality, the ability to stand back, the figure of blind justice, is defined by the other as the problem, as detachment, as a lack of care. So, what I'm going to say at the end, Bacon took the mythology of the common law and invented scientific reason. Law was then given an obligation to live up to scientific reason, to itself scientize. And that ideology, over time, has become a transcendental ontology. People assume law is about rules, law is about justice, law is about fairness. And what I wanted to demonstrate, if I had much more time, is that none of that is true. Law is not determinate, law is not impartial, law is certainly not objective. It doesn't produce equity or equality. No legal system that I know of, past or present, meets any defensible standard of justice. Law is not rules, impartiality, equality, or justice. Law is the deployment of overwhelming violence. Law is the technique by which socialized violence is distributed. And we have to think about violence in quite a wide sense. Think about property. What does it mean to own something? It means you have the exclusive right of possession, you have the exclusive right of use, and you can, if you choose, give those to others, but no other may take them off of you. Because if another takes them off of you, you may go to the police and demand access to state violence to vindicate your claim to that property. So private property, by definition, is ownership combined with socialized violence. I don't think that's good or bad, I think that's just a fact. But one implication of that fact is that it would be very easy for a government to put limits on property. It would be very easy for a government to say, after $100 million, we will not protect wealth. In fact, we will reclaim that wealth as our own as a payment for protecting the rest of the wealth. So we could be talking about violence without it being negative. Violence is just a fact. A legal order needs violence. And so the question that I wanted to ask, I obviously don't have time, and I don't really have the answer anyway, is how would a feminist legal system, how would a legal system based on the ethic of care, based on relationality and context, how would it discipline the uncaring? How would this legal system authorize the exercise of violence? And my assumption is it wouldn't be through rules. Because A, the rule form is inherently masculine, and B, the rule form doesn't work, so we may as well try something else. And what Gilligan offers us is a non-mystical answer to the critique of reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. And I think we're going to open it now for questions. Except I have to find one so you will take over. Sure. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Thank you, Jason. This was really interesting. I have a question. So I'm wondering if, in telling the story as a contingent story of the history of the European rise of reason, logic, and scientific inquiry, we're actually disregarding alternative paths that may have led towards very similar understandings of law and similar understanding of scientific reasoning. So I'll use the example that I'm familiar with, that we see within the Islamic legal tradition, before the whole issue of separation from the church and so on, you see a shift towards rationalization and logically based induction. You also see early iterations of scientific knowledge experimentation as proof of scientific fact, maybe not in the same manner as we see a fully articulated theory of science, but in telling that story from that perspective, aren't we disregarding that there might be other reasons that go beyond the specific European experience?
I think that's perfectly valid. And I can't tell why, but for some reason I'm not concerned. And that could be just because I'm still very, very Eurocentric in my thinking. I think it's because the reason I'm talking about has a pretty widespread hegemony over the way we think. But in a way, I wanted to tell the story, the history of reason, to show that I'm not making things up. But the only real point I want to make is that if we want to bring feminism and law together, we need to structurally rethink the way we understand law. So, what worries me slightly about what you're saying is that reason might be less contingent than I think it is. And I'm very deliberately backing off from making big scientific claims. It may be that scientific reason works in science. The only problem is we've nothing to compare it against. And we also have people like Paul Feyerabend arguing for epistemic anarchy and methodological anarchy. And my understanding of the sociology of science is that most scientists don't use the scientific method. Again, it's like law, it's an ideological repackaging of results that were found in other ways. But again, at the risk of cowardice, I'm restricting my observations to law, and probably pretty much to modern Western law.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to be a little bit, to love you the wrong way.
Oh, surprise.
For the sake of, so I'm actually interested in trying to find a way to save the scientific method from the historical condemnation, provided, which actually very traditional, very powerful. and trying to see actually whether this association that you establish between a particular way of relating to the natural world is so much implicated in social order. And so I'm trying to ask myself, what is the Copernican revolution and why is it such a revolution? I mean, it's true, it extracted theology from, science of theology, etc., but I think there's something very subtle in what makes Copernicus revolutionary in that sense, is that by decentering the Earth from the universe, basically decentered our experience of the world as a source of information or knowledge, to actually relate to the fact that our observation could in fact lead us to contradictory results. Same observation that could actually lead us to understand the Earth being the center, but also the Earth being all the things. But there's something else. And so there's something about the scientific revolution which is about questioning the actual knowledge that we establish through observation, which is always tainted with our social, etc., etc. There's something about the scientific method that Bacon doesn't capture, which I think is performed by Copernicus, that actually is a key to uncover, the patriarchy that is embedded in our way of knowing the world. And so in that sense, the fact that he did a separation between how we know and what is epistemology and ontology in this way is actually, not necessarily male, and in fact, it could be the only way we could have in order to uncover the hidden bias of, or not the pervasive, male-centric.
Yeah. So this is really hard for you. Let me start.
So again, this is just for I wanna.
Let me start by stating the obvious,
Mm.
which is that I was trying to offer a critique of rationality using purely rational arguments, which is inherently problematic. The second point is I'm very ambivalent on scientific method. I'm ambivalent from a research perspective because I don't think it matches scientific reality. I'm ambivalent from a normative perspective because I don't like the pursuit of objectivity. I think it's a dangerous idea. And yet, we need means to discern truth from fiction. Which means we need definitions of truth that are relatively stable. Plus side for the scientific method is it has created a stable system of truth. The downside for me is it's created a system of truth that's allowed us to all but destroy the planet. And had there been much more, dare I say, emotion in scientific thinking, then I think we would be ecologically in a much better place. So maybe the best thing for me to say would be, and I did say it in the longer version of this paper, scientific reason almost certainly has a place. Where that place is, I'm not sure. But where I don't think that place is in the legal system. And again, ultimately this is not going to be a paper about the philosophy of science. I'll have to do some work on feminist epistemology for legal reasoning, but I'm happy at this point to leave the scientists to do science, as long as we all agree with Popper that science isn't about truth, but prediction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, everyone's trying to wait out.
No, it's something to process, and it will take time for.
But I think we were only scheduled for an hour.
Yeah. So if there's nothing else, I mean, I have lots of things to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it works better with working.
Yeah. All right, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.